Menon, a long-time resident of Houston. I have spent the past 32 years of my life in the United States, with most of the time was actually spent in my teaching career, but prior to that I did my graduate work in anthropology and sociology in Houston as well as at the University of Pittsburgh. I do have a passion for the work that I'm doing. However, my research interest has really taken me back to India, where I grew up. My job today here is to share with you the great benefit of the wisdom of a wonderful team of panelists who are here with us today to discuss some of the salient features of the presentation that was just made to you by Bharath Srinivasan. But before I do that, I would be inviting each of the 5 members, esteemed members on the panel, put together for you this afternoon. It will be my great pleasure to invite each of them to the stage here. But I'm actually struck by the intensity of the issues that our youth have been facing and continue to face in the American educational system. So to lighten up things, let me share with you what I just heard from the state of Kerala, and I happen to be from that state, the one of a kind in the entire universe, and you know why. I just heard the news that the Minister for Education, who represents the Indian National Muslim League, who has been actually controlling the education portfolio in Kerala for the past 40 years, not surprisingly, they have decided to go green in a rather peculiar way. What I heard was that the minister has actually decided to change the chalkboards in Kerala's classrooms into green, from black to green. Yes. And his claim was that it is his honest intention to support Kasturi Rangan's report for further greening Kerala. So, yeah. And it's even more interesting when you think about it. It coincides with the beginning of the Ramadan season. So, if you're interested in pursuing that piece of entertainment, please turn to Kerala channel and get along. Thank you. So let me invite and introduce to you the members of this wonderful panel. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Anjali Pinjala. Dr. Pinjala is a practicing family psychologist in Houston. She is a former director of the Texas Institute of Family Psychology, and currently she is a consultant for medical clinics in creating a behavioral health arm to their practice. Dr. Pinjala is also a long-time Houston resident. Welcome. Our next panelist is Dr. Aparna Subramaniam. Aparna Subramaniam is a medical graduate from India and is currently pursuing her postgraduate studies in Texas Public Health in Houston. Besides medicine, Aparna is committed to pursue her passion in Indian fine arts, especially in Bharatanatyam and Kathak. He has a great involvement in the study of Bharatanatyam, and he happens to be a trained classical dancer. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me now. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry, you missed the joke. Now Kerala. If time permits, I'll repeat it. I'll be happy to. Third, as Dr. Bharath Srinivasan, of course, you have already heard his wonderful presentation. Dr. Bharath Srinivasan, as you all know, is by training an engineer from the Indian Institute of Technology in New Delhi, And he happens to be a Yajurvedi, plus deeply knowledgeable in Upanishads and Puranas. Dr. Srinivasan also happens to be on the faculty of the Asha Vidya Satsang. It's a great honor to have you here. And next, of course, is Professor Chitra Divakaruni, who is, I don't think I need to introduce Dr. Divakaruni. Yes, she's so well known to all of us and beyond the confines of Houston. Dr. Divakaruni is a distinguished chair in the Department of Creative Writing and Literature at the University of Houston. She is, of course, a well-known author of many bestseller fiction. And Professor Divakaruni is both academically and socially at the forefront of many national and local initiatives. It's a pleasure to have you here. Last but not least, my pleasure to invite Dr. Subroto Gangopadhyay, who is a practicing cardiologist in Houston and has 23 years of experience in medicine. Dr. Gangopadhyay describes himself, and I would rather quote him, it's quite interesting but succinct. He describes himself as a student of India and an Indian student of the West. Happy to have
A fury fighter and a warrior of Indian culture.
You will see that in a few minutes for sure. So thank you all for joining us today. My plan here is to present to them based on Professor Dr. Srinivasan's presentation on Sati's portrayal and some facts added in his presentation. I have prepared a set of domains or probe questions, and they are indeed open-ended. So I am going to present these questions not in any particular order, and I would welcome each member of the panel to take, I would say, perhaps 2 minutes to respond as succinctly as you can to each of these questions. So if you are all ready, I think we can. My first question is going first to Bharatji himself. You have stated that there is a mention of ritual suicides in other cultures in the books that you reviewed. If so, what discrepancies or inconsistencies, if any, do you observe in the manner of reporting of the topic?
I think from the start, are you hearing me?
Yes.
I think if you read the textbooks, which is Texas textbooks as well as the other history textbooks and world history textbooks in general, I think I can make this remark pretty confidently. When you come to the section on Hinduism, see, most of these books has been written by Western authors and people from the West, because they have institutional backing, they have the financial backing, and they have governmental backing. And whenever there is a government institutional financial backing, there is always an agenda. Though they may say they are on a neutral path, there is an agenda, and therefore I think when you, let's say if you have the case of the samurai warriors, or I'm just taking as an example, it's presented in a very positive context in general. But when it comes to things like Sati, it's presented in a very negative and a very fashion which is very repulsive, I should say. So I think from that context, I think I've answered your question. When the issue of ritual suicide, which is in the case of samurai warriors, or I was just hearing when I was driving to this place that after some years of 60 or so, or 70 or so in ancient Japanese society, just 100 years ago, they used to send their parents to the mountains and push them off the cliff. I'm not just joking. I'm not making this up. This came in the news today when I was driving the car, because that's how the society works. So nothing big is made about that. But when it comes to Sati, it's all blown out of proportion. That's what I felt, and so that's all.
Thank you, Bharatji. I will alternate between the two sides. Dr. Pinjala, what is your take on this?
Well, can you all hear me, or should I use this? Use this? I think it's on. It's on? Okay. I agree with what was said before, and you know, when I think about it, any behavior, we have to look at time and place, you know, the context within which it was performed. And if we think about Sati, you know, when we think about just a behavior, especially in psychology, if we think about a certain behavior, we think, oh my God, that's such a horrible behavior somebody does. And we put all kind of judgments and negative connotations on it. But if you really understand the meaning about why that behavior is performed, it creates empathy and deeper understanding. I think that's what we really need to do with Sati. I don't know that we have done a good job of understanding it as Hindus, but we need to understand why this would, what role did it play in society, in Indian society, in that place and time. And once we have that, because, you know, when we talk about, you know, I think one of the little girls who came, they talk about the shame they had when things were discussed in the textbook without an understanding of why it was done. So I think it's important to understand that aspect of it.
So, do you think that there was a lack of proper contextualization there?
Absolutely.
In presenting the matter?
Absolutely, and I think that's what we need to delve in more. Obviously, it's an awful practice that, you know, I don't think we're condoning it, but I think it behooves us to understand within the context why. You know,
thank you. Chitraji, do you have a familiarity with the situation that I just described? An observable imbalanced reporting of historical facts.
Yes, I think I've noticed that in the school textbooks, which I think, you know, do have a certain mindset. And I think actually I want to commend our three young speakers because they really brought this out very well. And I think they really brought out why is this problematic. It's problematic because the young person who comes from the child, who comes from that culture, is made to feel that something's wrong with their culture. And that anything that's not in sync with the American way of life, there's something wrong with it. And I think that's a larger problem when a history is written from the point of view of someone who's not from within that history. It's very hard to get that part right. It's very hard to get the context right. It's very hard for us to understand, as we must if we are going to be global citizens, that there are many aspects and something can be interpreted very differently from inside the culture. And that's really the correct aspect. How does the culture view it? Why does the culture view it in this way? What was the historical reason? I thought your final summary on how we look at Sati today, yes, it was a terrible thing, but these are the historic reasons it happened. And this is how much it happened. And I think, you know, also, it's so ironic to me that so much space is given in the textbook to something that occurred really in the context of other Hindu happenings, if we were to call it. This is like a very small thing, and it's like completely blown out of context.
So you see there's a lack of proportion there.
Lack of proportion, lack of context, and the attitude with which it is described.
Thank you very much. Aparna, would you like to add to this? And I say this because my next question, actually I wish to direct, sorry I cannot give you a break, Chitraji. The next question, I want you to start off with that. Yes, since you spoke on the Indic perspective, I have a question here. From an emic or insider's perspective, Sati is described as a woman's ultimate voluntary moral statement. But from an ethic or an outsider's or comparative perspective, the same act is interpreted, not described, but interpreted as yet another instance of the universal male dominance, or as a way of the widow of the vanquished escaping the victor. In this case, is Bharath referred to the series of Islamic conquests. So, do you see this as a way of the widow of the vanquished escaping the victor? Are modern academics justified in giving interpretations as opposed to accommodating descriptions from within?
Well, again, you're going back to what I was talking about, that there are histories told by people from within the culture, and histories, that's the emic, and then histories that are interpreted by outsiders, sometimes historians, sometimes anthropologists, and that's the etic. And I think, again, if you are describing as far as possible, you want to keep it objective, especially if you're not from within the culture, but also in the material that I was reading from the textbooks, from this textbook and other textbooks, there's often a sense that here was a terrible custom and the British came and they fixed it for India. And this, I know from growing up in Bengal where this happened, this is not true. There's no mention, or there's not much mention of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who fought deeply and, with great passion to improve the situation, not only of Satis being burnt, but of the living widow and her conditions, and of widow remarriage. Why is there no mention of such things? It just makes us think that there's already kind of an agenda around which these descriptions occur. And once again, I really want to, commend our young speakers, because you actually stood up and spoke out against this. You presented the culture as you knew it, from having lived it from within the culture. And that is very difficult to do. That's difficult for me as an adult, but especially for you in a classroom situation at an age where people just want to conform. They don't want to be different. I know this from my own children who went through school. You don't want to stand out. You don't want to make waves. And I think it was extremely brave of you and extremely valuable for the other children in the classroom, because they really got a glimpse of what is true.
Thank you. Subroto, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I think the very discussion begins with a ethic perspective, because your first question was ritual suicide. Is it neither a ritual nor a suicide? A ritual is something which is practiced very commonly by way of habit. And I think the Western perspective of a ritual, to lift the spirit is makes it spiritual. It's a spiritual voluntary immolation. So it would be what I would describe it as Agni Pravesha. The term for suicide in Indic perspective is Atmahatya. So it is as much of an Atmahatya as a man trying to save a drowning man and drowning himself, or as much as an Atmahatya as a soldier fighting a battle, knowing that the battle is useless and succumbing to his war injuries. So suicide too.
Sorry. So would you consider Sati as Atmahuti rather than Atmahatya?
Yes, because in the perspective of the voluntary performance of Sati was that marriage is an irrevocable, indissoluble, transcendental conjugal bond. And that's the perspective of marriage. And so from the perspective of the voluntary Sati, of which there were very few, I think it is entirely preposterous to describe it as ritual suicide. It's a dishonor to these people. Secondly, I want to also mention the word ritual, that at its peak in Bengal, with a population of 50 million in the presidency, annual death rates of about 1.5 million, and Sati figures that hover around 600 a year, the ritual was practiced by 0.25%. So I think I'm just trying to to put into perspective that these questions and the discussion itself is an Vedic perspective discussion, because every discussion on India does not have an Indic perspective. Every discussion on the West has only an Indic perspective. So the fact of discussing this in English, of using terms loosely, itself is a disservice to this entire discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Let's move on to my next question, and this is to Aparna. From the sources cited in Balaji's presentation, it is obvious that Sati remained largely a volitional deed on the part of women. But why do you think the books tend to portray a different picture of this practice?
I think it's still, you can capture your voice.
So, speaking of the previous question too, and coming to the volitional deed, you realize that there was no male dominance when the situation is volitional or voluntary. The woman was given a choice. She had her freedom. So there is no male dominance earlier too. If she had the choice to lead the life of an ascetic, or she had the choice to commit sati, which she chose. So I think it is very hard for an outsider to understand this choice that the woman made, because it was a personal choice, and to look at it from the outside would seem that it was the society that made her do it rather than her own personal choice that made her do it. And all the textbooks portray it this way, but they do not portray the value systems that the women practiced which made her do it, rather than the societal pressures that made her do it. And Bharatji also mentioned the reasons that were given in the Smriti text for which the woman performed this act. And one of them was that she could live with her husband in another world, in another sphere. But they did not mention this in those textbooks. They would rather put it forward as something that was coerced for the woman to perform, rather than do it on her own. And that, I think, again comes from their trying to make us look at it in a different way and make us question our own value systems rather than accept the deeds that were performed.
Thank you. Anjali, would you like to add?
I think I agree, but I would like to play devil's advocate here. Not to be a devil's advocate, but just because I have a curiosity. And actually, I'd like Dr. Srinivasan too, because you sounds like you're very learned in this. One of the things we talked about is that you know, one of the reasons for sati is that we are with our marriage partner for eternity. And a thought keeps popping in my head. And of course, absolutely no disrespect, but I was wondering if there is a male version, because if we're talking about, right? If we're talking, and I'm respectfully asking that question.
I think more than my respect or things like that, I think the issue is very important, and it needs to be hammered and clearly understood. Of course, certain things, rationalization is not an easy thing, especially in these kind of topics. Yes, if you see, there's a text which, if you see, the name of that text is Indian Antiquity. In that, there's a lot of self-immolation by men along with their masters. There's plenty. So only thing you don't find much mention of it because it is so common at that time. Like man is going for battle along this commander, they're going to die. They know they're going to die, but they just walk into that because that's the last option they had. So if you see Indian Antiquary is a book, there's a lot of instances where a lot of male servants, as well as they followed the queen who committed sati. All the male servants also followed the queen and went into the fire. So this is also the only thing, this doesn't get reported. By the time when the British came, it became only the lady doing the sati is only seen, because the earlier times, much earlier, before the advent of the British, you will find that this is also.
Yes, and of
so
course,
over a period of time, it became sort of concentrated or individual, or sort of narrowed down only to the lady alone to do it. Incidentally, one of the kings of the Raghu dynasty, I forgot his name, he commits sati along with his wife. when she dies. I forgot the name. There's just one instance, but I forgot the name. I can give you a reference after seeing
In
it.
2001, there is in 2001 in the Gangopadhyay district in Orissa, a gentleman called Sarath Mohanty performed Sati by stepping into the funeral pyre of his wife, Sarjuwala Mohanty. And I think one has to also understand that the gender roles as understood involve the men going into the battle and the women not going into the battle but being the keepers of dharma and tradition.
That's
And therefore these gender roles were acceptable to those that they were assigned to. So if men committed sati and women committed sati, we would have a nation of orphans. So I think it must be understood in that context as well.
It is clear.
Actually, the gender roles, as I think I just want to add what Subroto said, gender roles are so, it's that her role is in the home and she protects Dharma there. This guy's role is outside and he protects Dharma outside. And the whole, I think if you really deeply see why in Rajasthan still Hindu culture prevails, I think a lot of it was attributed to this, I think terrible acts of, I'm not saying terrible, great deeds of self-sacrifice and just to maintain the culture. That's a statement which is going on. This is my culture, gentlemen, and whether you like it, this is it.
From a social scientific angle, and I think Chitraji, you would probably agree that in the Eastern world we believe in either gender complementarity or gender parallelism rather than gender competition. Expecting women to mimic men or expecting men to mimic women. They could be making a statement in two different languages, symbolic systems. Is that correct? What do you think?
Yes, I think gender roles are very different in each culture, and it's just important to start off by realizing this and by appreciating the positive aspects of gender roles in each culture rather than saying that the Western model is the model and anything that deviates from it must be a problem. I think that's a good place to start from. And then if we really look at what's happening in India, we notice that there are changes that are occurring, and that are occurring by the desire of the people who are living in that culture. So culture is a living thing. It moves and it changes. And that's why I think, I was kind of aghast that so much space in the textbook is given to sati, which is no longer a major part of our culture, in fact never was a major part of the culture, and yet these children are being subjected to being taught it and to having to defend it and feeling bad about it and all of that.
Chitraji, the statement you made just now, I thought that is quite interesting because that's going to take me directly into the next question, and I'm going to open this up to all the members of the panel. If you could briefly address this question. And that is, and I shall read this out again, it's a social scientific angle. The social scientists have often asserted that social deviance is relative to time and place. From this angle, therefore, do you think it is fair to retrospectively discuss today the meaning and consequences of a practice or norm that existed in the distant past? If so, why? And I'm going to open up this question to all of you. Who would like to go first? Subroto.
Again, the question is a very Western one. Now, much of this debate, as you see, happens in the 19th century in a post-Enlightenment milieu. And the descriptions that you see actually speak of the Enlightenment language, and those who have gone through Edmund Burke, or those who are looking at Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, describe very vividly the satis in terms of their beauty and their ideas of sublime and horror. So, and in the same parallel century, England has been a nation of wife beaters. It was a raging problem in Europe and England. In the precise century, they were claiming to deliver the brown women. And if one goes through the legislations in England in 1853 of aggravated assault act, which for the 1st time pretended to give women equal protection to a poodle dog or for cutting a bush, because if you broke the jaw of your wife, you got a fine for 10 shillings, or you went to jail for 2 weeks. So it is that civilization which is now recovering from its own disorders and diseases, and the Enlightenment thinkers and the people who are steeped in that mode are looking at India through those very eyes and really cannot even understand what the conjugal relationship, marriage, and woman's love and affection and reverence for a husband means, and vice versa. So I will mention it.
Thank you. Aparna?
Also we have to understand that prior to the Islamic invasion or the Mughal invasion, the mention of sati is very less, but post-Islamic invasion and mostly in the warrior classes or the noble classes, we see the mention of sati and the practice of sati coming up. And so that war by itself is a social deviance, and we have to understand that sati was a practice that came out of a social deviance and was practiced because of that social deviance, which in itself could be considered a social deviance from the Western world. But for the women of that time, war was a social deviance, and they were trying to conform to their moral values in times of social deviance by committing sati or practicing their dharma or retaining their values by practicing sati. And so we have to understand that it was in times of such distress that women committed this. And they do not portray these times of distress at all. They do not mention the invasion. They do not mention the horrendous acts that were committed on women at the time of invasion. And all those are actually definitely social deviance. And to consider that war today and war then was definitely not the same. And
that's a very interesting improvement upon this deviance theory itself, to suggest that external causes might be seen as the trigger factor for internal aberrations. What is your take on that?
You know, look, every culture throughout history has had behaviors that they're not proud of, and I think that you know, the idea of sack from you know, just from my personal perspective is it wasn't a good one. But what we have to look at is when, I mean, even like you talked about the British, they would sacrifice people when they put up a huge building, Druidstan, they'll sacrifice people under the you know, the foundation stones. So we have all had, you know, every single culture you can think of that's had, you know, some killing of people and suicides and whatever you call it. But I think what's important, like you said, looking at it, the perspective in today's time and today's place, we need to, instead of condemning it or even justifying it, why do we need to justify it? You know, what we need to do is to understand why it was done and how it benefited the people in the society in that time and place.
Thank you. What about you, Chitra?
Yes. I just wanted to add something to what you were saying, and also in terms of like percentage, right? The amount of weight that's given. So before I came here, I was asking my son, who's in college, I said, I'm going to go to this talk, what do you think about this? And he said, yes, I remember. He went through the school system, he read the same textbook, and he said, you know, in the history of every religion, there are those moments that we are not proud of. But in terms of the other religions, are they focusing on them as much? Is when Christianity is discussed in the textbook, is the Spanish Inquisition given a whole page among the however many pages? Are the Crusades in which thousands of people were killed, is that given emphasis? If not, why is it that in our religion the negative is given such focus? I think that is something that we can definitely work on correcting. And again, I just want to say that, you know, getting upset about this and pointing the finger at the other people is not what we want to do. We want to see how we can make this situation better.
Thank you. And Bharatji, would you like to add?
What is negative or positive is such a relative thing with respect to space, time, and for the person concerned. The great yogi may be there, and the foreign what is negative and positive could be quite different from us. this, if you accept a stage called a yogic stage or stage of samadhi, it's totally going to be different. So one should understand the basic structure of our ancient culture was based on an inner realization, and make sure that's why the word Sati itself comes from the word who is a realized the life, basic truth of life. Such a lady is called Sati. Now all the other acts which we have seen, which should be in alignment with that basic principle. So that is something, a core value which we should be able to try to understand. And from today's, modern Western, narratives, which is based on secular democracy, progressive stuff, all the progressive development of, which I think is an evolution of from Protestant Christianity. If you try to map this onto that, you'll come to a conclusion it's going to be negative. Right. So what is negative and what is positive, you should try to transcend this current space-time and try to reposition yourself. You should try. For that you should understand what is dharma. It's a hard stuff because we have moved too far away from all that. What is Tri Dharma? What is Purusha Dharma? What is Atma Dharma? What is Pativrata Dharma? What is Ashrama Dharma? There's so many things. All that, you should have a good global picture of all that to come to a good conclusion. Everything can be misused. That's always there. So there are a lot of misuse which has happened. That's quite obvious. There's a lot of people, for so many reasons, have forced women who are in a very, very bad state after her husband has passed away, and just push her into a corner and try to exploit her. That could have happened and has happened. But that should not be the way to judge the act itself. That's what I would say. Like, we are all a part of a union of two people, a man and a woman. The act itself is sacred, but the person performing it can misuse an act. But the act is sacred. The act is great. The act is supreme. It is Shringara Rasa. From that only we all evolved. So are you going to condemn the act or the actors? So you have to be careful what you say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In conclusion, I have just one last question. Again, I would invite all panelists to respond briefly to this. I wrote this down, but during the course of the last 25 minutes, I decided to rephrase it. It was sounding very positive, but I feel free to make it somewhat negative. It's all right, I guess. So the picture I get from the discussion here, as well as from the presentation by Bharath is that indeed there is a very clear misportrayal of a civilization, its heritage, where deviant aberrations are often blown out of proportion and are made to appear as norms, normative practices. And very clearly, the Indian American students, especially who have been attending our schools here, I see this as a very clear case of victimization, whereby students are imposed some very distorted picture of a reality which they would want to cherish for the rest of their lives. However, they take away some very negative ideas and portrayal of their own heritage. So it's very clear to me that there is some injustice, I'm putting it mildly, and as being the field of education, it is gross injustice, it is unfair. So what do you think it can happen to the young generation who have been exposed to this misportrayal of Indian heritage? What do you think the consequences of this exposure would be for the young generation? And secondly, the effort that a young organization like the India History Awareness and Research Project has undertaken and has presented before you today, this initiative. What do you think such effort, how do you think such efforts can contribute to the well-being of the Indian American community here? So, who would like to go first? Dr. Pinjala? You've been a psychologist and you have nearly 30 years of experience with that. I'd like you to take the lead here.
You know, in my clinical practice, one of the things that I see when I see our Hindu kids coming to see me is almost a hiding of their identity. Not all the kids. I think one of the mitigating factors is parental influence. But what I notice is they're not proud of their culture. They're not proud of their religion. When I see little girls with the bindi on, it makes me so proud because I know that you have the self-confidence to wear that, and that's wonderful. You know, but I think what part of that is how they're being seen in American society. They're living in a society where, you know, their culture is portrayed in textbooks, like you know, you guys talked about. And that is a general understanding, because one of you said that, you know, what you learned when you were a little kid, the first introduction you have to an idea or culture sticks with you. So we get our first ideas from our textbooks, and that sticks with you. And like you say, it's the gospel truth. I believe I said gospel. Delete that word. But so that is very powerful. And so being able to change those narratives is very helpful to our kids because of their, you know, their own identity. We want to be able to have our kids being proud of who they are, because our heritage is so deep and powerful, and we want our kids to understand that aspect of it, rather than somebody throwing bodies in the Ganges, or you know, some despicable, some demeaning aspect without an explanation. So I think what our changing of the textbook would do is help create that. Of course, you know, parental influence is very important. I think, you know, like these two proud young women sitting here, they talked about their gurus and their mentors and their family influence that made them get to that perspective. So I think that is important too. But definitely start with textbook. And not only that, the community around and their classmates understanding their culture from a perspective that is not ethnocentric is also very important.
Thank you. And yes, Aparna?
I would just like to add one more thing, is that apart from viewing our culture from our own eyes, we should also start viewing other cultures from our eyes and not accept what they say blindly. Just like how the Westerners view us, we should learn to view the Westerners too and start questioning what they are presenting in their textbooks about themselves. Just like they question us, we should have that authority, and we should read more so that we can question. Questioning is always good. It'll get you those answers that you're seeking for. And so you should always, I think, be confident enough to know about yourself as well as question the outsider who is asking you. So I think that is very important too.
Subroto?
I have two comments to make. The first one is in the perspective of Sati. You know, Gayatri Spivak says, "Can the subaltern speak?" And Matamani has done quite a bit of work, then goes on to extend that and says, "Can the subaltern be heard?" Now I'm going to say that it is time for the subaltern to act and decide. That's one. The second perspective that I have is teaching of Indian children in American textbooks can lead to formation of negative images and stereotypes, not only in Indians, but in the growing generation of Americans, and in the engagement of nations in a culture of globalization that we preach. If India decided to have a similar outlook in putting into its textbooks features about American culture, I'm sure we will have a never-ending civilizational war. If one puts in an Indian textbook that date rape is a very common phenomenon in the US, and so the whole institution of dating ought to be really outlawed, because it is indeed a shameful tradition. Dating is. But if you look from the Western perspective, it's really outgrowth of Europe's stepping into individualism. It begins in the 12th century with the troubadours singing and love ballads and saying that, look, it is about individualism. We are outside the yoke of the church. we have the power and the ability, and we want to decide for ourselves. So really, if you look at growth of the tradition, it has some value to it. It cannot negate it. But it could be presented in a very negative way. And there are several such features that can be presented in a negative way. Today, 25% of kids born in Fallujah have developmental defects because of dirty moms. Women in Fallujah are saying, we are not going to bear children. 600,000 to 1 million people have supposedly died, according to Lancet, in the war. So how about these as modern features? How about the fact that 120 Buddhist monks immolated for Tibet, which is praised by the United States, and 40 of them died, and Dalai Lama praised as an act of courage. So it is not as if only one can play at the game. So I think there is a great amount of restraint and care that is needed to put across and teach your children what is true and proper.
Thank you. And speaking of Subroto, this is a question specifically for you, perhaps, and let me read
Can
it.
I just
Sure, please.
say something about what I've noticed? And because I teach in college, I notice a lot of young people, you know, coming in to sometimes to talk to me, but I also notice them in their social situations. And I would say that here in Houston, we are in a relatively good situation because we have a large Indian community. We have classes that, spiritual classes that these children can go to. We have a lot of societal influence. But in smaller cities, this problem is much worse because those kids really don't have other forms of support. What they read in the textbook is what they get. And they really, you know, they begin to dissociate from the culture much more strongly. And they will generally go on to date and marry people outside of the culture and move away from the religion as well. So I think, you know, one has to understand that the impact of something like this, just words on a page that you study for maybe 2 or a couple of weeks, can have a very long lasting influence. You're made to feel ashamed, you're made to feel that something's wrong with you and your culture, and this is going to really affect your other decisions because you're made to feel this way when you're very young. And, you know, yeah.
Thank you. And lastly, Balaji,
No,
would you like to add? Okay. Thank you all very much, and that concludes the question answer session or the panel discussion involving me as a moderator. My next task is to share with the panelists and the audience a number of questions that we have fielded from our respectable audience, and depending on subjective availability of time, if time permits, I will actually take you through every question I received. But I see that some of the questions have already been addressed by the panelists. Therefore, let me begin with this question here. How do you look at the portrayal of Sati in Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? And also with this you already referred to it. Especially how she questions the notion of patriarchy. Chitra, would you like to just the questions?
This is a question that is better.
I think.
Okay, I think, well, you know, I think Gayatri is talking about the situation of women within the context of Indian society, and truly in many places that situation is problematic. I think one of the important things that we must do, even as we love our culture and our religion, is look at where there are problems. And although the scriptures may speak very highly about women and their roles, many times in our society that is not carried out. So I think Spivak talks about a woman, especially in certain situations, as being very helpless in front of the powers that dominate her life. So I think there's a lot of accuracy in what she says, that there are these situations where the woman's role or the woman's choices become very limited. And unless we recognize that, we can't work on improving them. Unless we look at the current situations of violence against women in India, in Indian culture, we can't improve that. So we have to be truthful in looking at our own culture. Its greatness, yes. Its glories, yes. But also its problems. No culture is perfect. But if we ignore, we'll never move towards perfection.
Thank you. Would you like to add?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense as far as some abuses that could happen for females in our culture. I think the important point about it is our Vedas and our religious texts protects women and sees women in a very good way. But as human beings, we have to look at the human behavior also, and human beings, if there is a possibility to abuse, and you have that perception, you have that tendency, then you will do that. And a lot of times in our Indian society, women are in somewhat vulnerable positions, and people tend to utilize that to abuse them. So we have to look at what is actually happening versus what is prescribed in our religious texts and our moral values.
Right, thank you. Here's another question. Most of the panelists mentioned scriptural support. However, how do you convince agnostic, the non-believers, in the ethos of this practice? It's interesting that you ended with religions.
Which practice?
Sati. Yes, who would like to go? Aparna?
You haven't spoken.
I do not have mastery over spirituality or any of these to be knowledgeable enough to comment on this, but there are a few things, one or two things I would like to say. I read once that a non-believer is also a believer in the non-belief. So he is still a believer in something that is not existent, or he says is not existent. And that is where it lies. Belief, faith. You believe in something, and he believes in your non-belief, or he does not believe in your belief, or one of either ways. So I would say that it all comes back to your own perspective of it. And even in the women that we see, there were those women who committed sati. There were those people who dissuaded that woman from committing, but she still went on to commit. And that is where you could say that those people who dissuaded her were non-believers, or did not believe that by her committing sati, she would reach salvation or live with her husband in the other world or whatever. But still, it comes back to what you would think. And if you believe that it is your way of life, then you have every right or every freedom of choice and expression to be living that way. It is like how today we would have a stay-at-home father. If the man believes that he would be best utilizing his time and his energies by staying at home, then he should have every right to be able to do that. And there should be no question of somebody else believing that the man's role is to go out and work, saying that you believe in this, I am a non-believer in a stay-at-home father, so you should not be a stay-at-home dad. It's just like that.
Thank you. And yes, please.
Let me mention a famous non-believer, the one who established artificial intelligence lab at MIT, Dr. Minsky. And he's a very big proponent of cryonics. So, and in the United States, it's a growing movement where basically if you are cryopreserved at the moment of your death, then the belief is that in some point of time, technology will raise you back to life because your personality, your being is stored in some circuit in the brain. Interestingly, among the cryonics people, the rate of divorces are going up because the wives do not like the husbands to outlast them through this crazy screen. So here is a quick retort to the non-believer. The non-believer must not insist that nobody must have any belief. The non-believer is as free to his belief systems as the believers are. And that's the ethical foundation of being an atheist, I think.
Yes, and does it have to have a religious justification for the practice? You know, one wonders.
Absolutely, absolutely not. Self-immolation, the Tunisian revolution was started by an immolation by Muhammad Barzoi. This is in 2011. Japanese, one of the greatest Japanese authors, Mishika, Yukio Mishima, committed immolation in 1970. So it can be a statement of faith, it can be an expression of how deeply you feel about issues, like the man who immolated himself in the Washington Mall because the government shut down. So consequently, it may come from your spiritual beliefs, it may not, it may be a political statement. It may be a hunger strike.
And Bharath, would you like to respond to that?
I think that's
Okay. There's another question, and almost identical. I have two questions, so I'll combine them. As a high
I
school,
would like to know who the questionnaire. I'd like to see that. face.
some have names. Okay, I'll be glad to read
Who
the
asked the
statement.
agnostic question?
Here it is.
Great.
Oh, you've already found it. Okay, fine. Okay, here is a question from Samyukta Singh. And there's another question that's almost identical, so I'm going to combine the two. And it is, as a high school student, what can I do, or what steps can be taken to make a big noise about the misinterpretation of Indian history? What actions can be taken?
You know, I think the Hindu America Foundation is going to speak later. I think they will have the perfect answer, so let's wait on that to hear what they would have to say.
Right. And we are down to the viable 6 minutes. Okay, well I can. Yes.
I think we should just read the questions who have asked
Yes.
the repetition so that
Here's a
like to
question
honor the
from,
question.
yes, here's a question from Sri Shankaraya. As it could it be that in ancient times, women were property and not people? Subsequently, there was a blind adherence to this possessive practice. Who would like to respond? Of course.
That's a very Christian question. Because really, it really relates to the foundation of Christian faith. You can have St. Augustine, you can have Paul's, you can have multiple sources. You can even have the Canaanites, what they regarded women as. So I think the source of the question is very, very Christian. So this idea of property and who owns it, and God owns the earth, and then his representatives own the church, and church owns 1/3 of the Eros property, and then man owns his wife and therefore can beat her. And so I don't think that is really a question that is pertinent very much to us. But I would like a more spiritual answer from
I think
Bharath.
the spiritual answers are, I think, it needs to understand many of this. You all need to have a structured course on the various aspects of Hinduism, of what is patriarchy, for example. Why is nature patriarchal? We have probably asked these deeper questions. Is nature itself designed like that? Probably we have to see deeply. Things like things like this human body of property. Do you really own your body? To what extent do you own your body? There are a lot of very complex questions which we should, from our Western training, try to make it simplistic, because these things are very subtle and it needs a lot of training, and you all should read more widely and deeply to cross these barriers like this, which you have in your mind.
For Atman, everything is property, everything is material.
Exactly.
Here's a question, and of course, this question is going to be answered, as Chitra suggested, by the Hindu American Foundation. And the question is from Siddeshwar Giba. If and when the Western world decides to get any information related to Hinduism to be verified, is there a single source of contact in the East? So I'm going to leave that to the Hindu American Foundation. And lastly, here's another question. The last question is, it's very general of course, how is Hinduism represented when contrasted with Christianity in textbooks? So it goes beyond the Sati practice. Yes. HAF would answer. With that,
I think I would just ask anyone else has got any other question. There are some.
yes.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Oh, I'm not, I'm just saying I've read the textbooks, and in our textbooks right now, it's not so much Christianity as general Western ideals. When they portray Western things, they talk about how if it was bad, they corrected it, and it's not practiced now, and it's not done now. Like in Old Christianity, they talked about a little bit about the Crusades, but they portrayed the good side of it, and they talked about how they gathered information from it, how the Crusades were a religious struggle for that era, but they didn't really talk about the people they killed or what happened on the Crusades.
So what's your question?
Statement. That's it.
I just wanted to say, I think along those lines, the things that you talked about that were focused on in terms of the Hindu religion, like animal worship, the polytheistic religion, those are all misunderstandings of basic ideas. So certainly my hope is that those can be corrected, but I'd love to hear from the Hindu American Foundation.
Yeah.
Any question?
Question?
Why do you think that Sati is given such a big part in textbooks as such a religion? Because I really want to know who might have given them the information, or why the other better parts aren't portrayed.
It's the context. So essentially, first come the traders, and then comes the flag, and finally the cross. So consequently, I think you have to look at it from the perspective of the East India Company, what they were out to do, and then follow the missionaries, one really validating the need for the other. So when Laura Bush talks about how the rights of Afghani women are violated, she really tells the audience that American troops are needed. So consequently, it's validation of the need for the empire and colonial rule is the fundamental precept of this discourse that drives this thing. As for your question, is a very important one, because how can we correct it, why can't we correct it? The Eastern and Western streams in the arena of correction are entirely different. So the West sees itself as a nation of laws that come from a male god, that are transmitted through the prophet and inscribed in scriptures and then legislated, and therefore people talk about law. We are a society of dharma. So the Dharma Sutras are really books of jurisprudence, of the sources of law. They are not law. So we move in a different way. We move through societal movements. We don't necessarily move through law. And that is why with Rup-Kamar's immolation and the Sati Protection Act, there were 300,000 people to visit our shrine. So our movement is through dharma, and therefore the age of Dharma Sutras is not over. That Shayana wrote one 8 centuries ago is not to say that you cannot write one. So there can be a Dharma Sutra, there can be a social movement, there can be reinterpretation of dharma that is contextual to our times. And I think there is a need to do that, because that's how we have traditionally moved.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid that's all I have time for. Would you like to add just
to
one more
address
question?
Rachna's question.
Okay,
Because I
please.
think it's
Please.
You know, just to address your question, Rachna, I think that it's a very important point and one that we really need to address. During colonization, when the British, and throughout history, when a conqueror comes to a nation, what they try to do is minimize and demean that culture. And whether it's conscious or unconscious, the information in textbook tries to do that. When Chitra talks about Sati taking up this huge space in a very negative way, and then that's intentional. And so I think when the slaves came to America, they were dehumanized. So it's along the same lines. I think it's a very important thing for us to keep in mind. And with that, I want to put out a challenge here. Usually what happens, because of our sense of identity, if you notice, if there's a group of us meeting and there's Indians in the room, it's very difficult for another Indian to go and say hi or welcome them. Or if, yes.
That's right.
Or when you pass, so my challenge to you is next time you see an Indian, please go up and say hello. Or if you're in a group and an Indian person, please go invite them in and welcome them. Thank you.
That's a very good.
I'm afraid that's all I have time for. Thank you very much, Dr. Gangopadhyay, Dr. Divakaruni, Dr. Srinivasan, Dr. Subramaniam, and Dr.
I'd like to request the panelists to stay right there.
And it's indeed been a pleasure and honor for me to spend time to this time.
And we'd like to